Hey everyone, Tony D and Little Joan here, and this is a screenwriter's take, and I'm going to talk about Six Windows in the Desert by request. Still got a lot of Saudi Arabian fans ever since I started reviewing some of the Saudi stuff. We'll see if they continue to view me after this review. So I watched the first full episode of Windows of the Desert, and the deal is, from what I can understand, because it's not in English, it's subtitled, and it's very Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's really steeped in that culture, and I only know so much about Saudi Arabia, so watching it, the nuances really just go right past me. The first one, again, the fascination with watching stuff from another culture is not so much the actual plot, it's seeing the other culture and seeing what it's about and how they sort of live the day-to-day life in Saudi Arabia. So the first movie was about this play that was going on, and it was a lot like a play maybe going on, say, in the early 60s here, right? In the early 60s, if you put on a controversial play, you might have religious nutbags show up and say, Jesus doesn't like this play, right? That's still happening in Saudi Arabia, except instead of Jesus doesn't like this play, these are more, I think, Islamic fundamentalist, and I'm not quite sure how that works. I'm not sure if they're a religious sect or if they're a school that is partially religious. I mean, everything in Saudi Arabia is tied to religion. Everybody's a Muslim, and everybody's constantly referencing God. Now, it didn't really beat you over the head. I would say it is a religious culture. So the fact that there's all these mentions of God, I mean, it didn't seem like they were trying to push God on me or anything. It just is part of their culture, and how could you not? Which is interesting to watch, because I think in Western societies, people avoid mentioning God because they're afraid of getting blasted by this group or that group. And, it just, even back in the day, it was implied that, people were kind of Christian here. And now, like, oh my God, they wouldn't mention church if you paid them $1 billion, because they're too afraid of the reaction, unless it's a story about how bad churches are, or something. 9 times out of 10, not all the time, but in Saudi Arabia, there's no such compulsion, and it is super uber religious. So I guess it's kind of par for the course that if you put on a controversial play, and for them, they're extremely conservative, that people are going to show up. Now, first off, it's a very man-centric society, so almost all the characters are men, right? So the play has a woman in it, and the woman is played by a man, and then there's music in it, which was the thing they strongly objected to. At the same time, this turns into, kind of like one of those movies where they drill down in a side character, and they cut to a guy who's blind in the audience who's shown up to see the play after establishing all the various people who are coming to see the play and the actors and whatnot. And then suddenly we're in a story about this blind guy and how he became blind. I won't give away the ending, but it all ties in at the end. So that story was pretty good, although I did zoom through a portion of it because I got bored. But it wasn't bad. It tied in nicely. It felt a little like, Rushmore and the Mighty Tannenbaums, and those kinds of movies. It felt a little like someone aping that style. But it was good. It was decent. The second episode was from the perspective of a little girl. Now, this one felt really like a play. It felt like someone had written a play and then made a movie around it, because there wasn't a super compelling reason for the characters. It wasn't organic. It was very much about a little girl's perception of a maid who works for a semi well off family, I guess, in Saudi Arabia. I assume, since they could afford a maid, and they just abuse the maid, and they accuse her of all sorts of crazy things, including of being a witch. And the little girl kind of doesn't see why they treat her so poorly. And it wasn't bad, but for a 20-minute movie, it was kind of way too long, and I couldn't sit through the whole thing. So I definitely zoomed through that one, and the next one too. The next one was better, but again, I'm lost because I don't know the history of Saudi Arabia all that closely. So the premise was, I think it took place in like the 70s, and there was a plane crash, and it's about these guys surviving in the desert, and they're out in the desert for a long time, trying to survive, and which is kind of mildly interesting. They all sort of get on each other's nerves. Again, no women in it, so I guess they didn't want to deal with that theme in that desert thing. And then towards the end, a guy from the modern day shows up on a hike and tells them, well, you're not far from the highway, and tries to talk them out of, of staying near the plane wreckage, because they've been waiting for a rescue the whole time, and they've been arguing over that. And he wants to take them back to civilization. But I think the metaphor is these characters on the plane represent, or at least one of them does, represent people from a time when the Saudis were extremely paranoid and distrustful, and now it's a different time. I think that's the metaphor, but again, it's really hard for me to decipher because I don't understand the language, and there was stuff on the screen that was in Arabic that I didn't understand. I assume it's Arabic. I think it would be Arabic, right? So that one was interesting. I mean, they're interesting films, but again, it's more the culture than the actual story that plays out. And you do get kind of tired of seeing nothing but guys. The dynamic is kind of limited in that way because we're not seeing a lot of female characters, and when you do, they're all wives and whatnot. So in some ways it's interesting. These guys are trying to sort of flex their creative muscles and get some cool movies out about things in their culture, and they seem to be taking some amount of risk, but it's hard for me to know what's at stake because I don't understand the culture all that much. I mean, I know the basics of Saudi Arabia, and because I do a lot of anti-war stuff, I do follow some of it. I know the kingdom has a pretty aggressive foreign policy, especially towards Yemen, and there's a ton of problems in that area. I know they're a monarchy, and I know that they don't have freedom of speech. So whatever comes out of the kingdom has to be curated to some degree, or somebody could get in a lot of trouble. And if you get in trouble in Saudi Arabia, although they're trying to modernize their image, so maybe this is part of the loosening up of the restrictions that they're trying. So good for them. Good for the filmmakers trying to sort of push the envelope a little. I sense that they are, but it's hard to kind of gauge that being outside the culture and looking in. But if you want to see movies in another culture, Six Windows in the Desert, I think, is worth looking at because these guys are trying to stick sort of to the basics of screenwriting. And, in terms of character development, some of it's kind of old school, which in its own way is refreshing when you look at some of the films that are being produced here, which are just bogged down in identity politics and things like that. Even though these guys are bogged down in their own, more conservative views, they seem to be trying to push out from that a little bit. Not much, but a little bit. So I would check it out, if you're interested. But keep in mind you're kind of only gonna get so much, depending of your knowledge of the kingdom. But it is interesting to see how the filmmakers portray the sort of the average Joe living under the regime. So there's my review of Windows, Six Windows in the Desert. If you have a request, something you'd like me to review, a topic you'd like me to talk about related to screenwriting or movies or writing in general, please leave it in the comments. And thank you for tuning in. Check out my books on Amazon.com and, of course, thewebcomicfactory.com. We'll see you next time.